In this episode, we turn to a part of artificial intelligence, AI, governance that sounds simple at first but becomes more important the longer you think about it: transparency. When people hear that word, they often imagine a general promise to be open, honest, and clear, but in governance work, transparency is more than a good attitude. It is a real duty that shapes how organizations explain what an AI system is doing, how it should be used, what its limits are, and how its behavior will be watched after release. That duty matters because people cannot evaluate, trust, govern, or challenge a system they do not understand well enough to discuss in a meaningful way. For a beginner, the key idea is that transparency is not a decorative feature added after the system is built. It is part of responsible deployment from the start, and it becomes practical through technical documentation, clear instructions, and monitoring plans that show the organization is not only using the system, but also taking responsibility for how that use is understood and supervised over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to understand transparency duties is to ask a basic question: who needs to know what, and why do they need to know it? Different groups need different kinds of visibility into the system. Engineers may need technical detail about data, performance, model behavior, and dependencies so they can maintain the system properly. Risk, legal, and compliance teams may need enough documentation to judge whether obligations are being met and whether the use case remains defensible. Frontline users may need clear instructions about when the system should be relied on, when it should be questioned, and when it should be escalated to human judgment. People affected by the system may need understandable explanations about the role AI plays in a service or decision that concerns them. Beginners should notice that transparency is not one giant document handed to everyone in the same form. It is a duty to provide the right information at the right level to the right audience so that the system can be governed and used responsibly rather than being hidden behind vague claims or technical mystery. One of the most common misconceptions is that transparency means revealing absolutely everything about a system to absolutely everyone. That is not how serious governance works. An organization may still need to protect intellectual property, defend security-sensitive details, and avoid sharing information in ways that create new risks or confuse people who do not need deep technical depth. Transparency is not total exposure. It is meaningful clarity. That means the organization should be able to explain what the system is for, what kinds of inputs it uses, how it was evaluated, what its limitations are, what safeguards surround it, and how people can respond if something goes wrong. For a beginner, this distinction matters because it shows that transparency is tied to accountability, not to oversharing. A system can be guarded in some respects and still transparent in the ways that matter for oversight, user safety, legal duties, and trust. When organizations misuse secrecy as a shield against scrutiny, governance weakens. When they mistake uncontrolled disclosure for responsible openness, governance can weaken in a different way. Technical documentation is one of the main ways transparency duties become concrete. At a basic level, technical documentation is the organized record of what the system is, how it was built or configured, what data shaped it, what assumptions guided it, how it was evaluated, what limitations were observed, and what controls were put around it before and after release. This documentation is not just for engineers who enjoy detail. It supports governance because it preserves the evidence behind decisions that might later need to be defended, reviewed, or challenged. A beginner should think of technical documentation as the memory of the system. Without it, teams are forced to rely on verbal summaries, half-remembered decisions, and scattered files that do not clearly explain why the system behaves as it does or why leaders believed it was ready for use. When strong documentation exists, organizations are in a much better position to answer hard questions, compare current behavior with original expectations, and respond intelligently when incidents or audits reveal that something has changed. Good technical documentation usually does more than describe the model in isolation. It explains the broader environment around the model, because a deployed AI system rarely operates alone. The documentation may need to cover data sources, pipeline assumptions, integration points, fallback procedures, human review expectations, approval history, version changes, testing results, and known weaknesses that should remain visible after launch. This matters because many harms do not arise from the model alone. They arise from how the model is connected to business processes, how outputs are interpreted, and how much authority people give the system in practice. Beginners often imagine documentation as something written once near the end of development and then stored away forever. In reality, strong technical documentation is a living governance artifact. It should be updated when major changes occur, when monitoring reveals new behavior, when incidents expose weak assumptions, or when the organization narrows or expands the approved use. A document that is technically complete but badly outdated does not meet the transparency duty in a meaningful way. Transparency also depends on instructions, which are often more important than beginners expect. Documentation may describe the system in detail, but instructions translate that knowledge into operational behavior for the people who will actually use, review, maintain, or supervise the system. A user who receives a system output does not always need a technical explanation of model architecture, but that person may urgently need clear guidance about what the output means, when it can be trusted, what warning signs to watch for, and what to do when the output seems uncertain, harmful, or inconsistent with other evidence. Instructions are therefore a critical part of responsible deployment. They prevent organizations from claiming they have a human in the loop when, in reality, the human was never given practical guidance on how to exercise independent judgment. For a beginner, this is a major lesson. Transparency is not fulfilled merely because information exists somewhere. It is fulfilled when people are given the kind of guidance that allows them to act responsibly in the role they actually occupy. Strong instructions usually explain the purpose and boundaries of the system in plain language. They should help the user understand whether the system is making a recommendation, generating draft material, prioritizing cases, summarizing inputs, or supporting another type of task. Just as important, they should explain what the system is not designed to do. A user who does not understand the boundaries of the tool may stretch it into decisions or contexts that were never properly assessed, and that kind of misuse often begins innocently. People are busy, they see something helpful, and they assume it can do more than the organization originally intended. Clear instructions help prevent that drift by defining expected use and by naming situations where the output should be reviewed carefully or not used at all. Beginners should notice that a large share of real-world governance failure comes from mismatched expectations. The system may be behaving within its design assumptions, while the humans around it are relying on it as though it had broader capability, stronger reliability, or greater authority than it actually possesses. Instructions also need to prepare people for limitations, because transparency, without practical warning, is incomplete. If a system is more likely to struggle with unusual inputs, ambiguous language, low-quality data, rapidly changing conditions, or certain categories of requests, users should know that before they rely on it heavily. If the organization expects people to challenge the system under certain conditions, those conditions should be described clearly and not left to vague intuition. If escalation paths exist, users should know how to use them and when the risk justifies stopping, slowing, or rerouting the workflow. This is one of the places where transparency and accountability meet most directly. It is not enough for an organization to know internally that a system has limitations. The people who operate near the system need enough guidance to recognize when those limitations may matter in live work. For a beginner, this makes transparency feel less abstract. It becomes a practical safety measure that shapes real decisions by helping users avoid blind trust, routine over-reliance, or careless expansion of the system into areas where its performance is less well understood. Monitoring plans are the third major piece of this topic, and they are essential because transparency duties do not end once the system is released. A monitoring plan explains how the organization will continue watching the system after deployment, what signals it will review, how often those reviews will occur, who is responsible for them, and what kinds of findings will trigger escalation or corrective action. This plan matters because AI systems can change in effect even when they have not changed in code. Data conditions shift, users adapt, workflows evolve, and hidden weaknesses may appear only after repeated exposure to the real world. A beginner should understand that a monitoring plan is part of transparency because it makes the organization's oversight posture visible. It shows that the organization has thought beyond launch day and has a concrete method for noticing whether the system remains fit for purpose. Without a monitoring plan, claims about responsible deployment often rest on hope rather than process. And hope is a weak control when real people are affected by system behavior. A strong monitoring plan usually makes several things clear. It identifies what the organization is trying to observe, such as performance decline, harmful outputs, unusual usage patterns, user complaints, workflow failures, security concerns, or emerging bias indicators. It also explains how those observations will be gathered, whether through logs, reviews, dashboards, audits, incident reports, sampling, or other operational mechanisms. Just as important, the plan should define decision thresholds and response paths so that teams do not have to invent governance under pressure when warning signs appear. If the system crosses a certain threshold of error, inconsistency, or risk, who decides what happens next and on what basis? Beginners sometimes assume monitoring is just a technical exercise run quietly in the background. In reality, a monitoring plan is a governance tool because it turns vague promises of oversight into repeatable action. It also supports transparency by making clear, at least internally and sometimes externally, how the organization intends to remain alert to emerging problems after the system begins influencing real work. Technical documentation, instructions, and monitoring plans are strongest when they reinforce each other rather than existing as separate paperwork streams. Documentation records what the system is, what it was assessed to do, and what limitations were known at release. Instructions translate that understanding into behavior for users, reviewers, and operators. Monitoring plans then test whether the real-world behavior of the system still matches the assumptions recorded in the documentation and the expectations reflected in the instructions. When these three elements are aligned, the organization is much better positioned to detect drift, correct misuse, and show that governance was designed intentionally rather than assembled after the fact. When they are misaligned, serious problems can follow. A documentation record may say the system should be used only in narrow ways, while user instructions quietly encourage broader reliance. A monitoring plan may watch speed and uptime, but ignore the types of harm that the documentation warned about. For beginners, this alignment issue is important because transparency is not just about having enough paper. It is about making sure the story told across the governance materials is coherent, accurate, and operationally real. This work is also cross-functional, which means no single team can usually satisfy transparency duties alone. Technical teams may produce deep detail about system behavior, architecture, and testing. Legal and compliance teams may identify what must be disclosed, retained, reviewed, or communicated to affected parties. Product and operations teams may understand what users need in order to apply the system responsibly under real workflow pressure. Security and privacy specialists may know which details can be shared broadly and which should be protected or handled carefully. Leadership may decide which risks are acceptable and which transparency commitments must be made publicly. Beginners should see that transparency is not a writing task handed to one department at the end. It is a governance process that gathers facts, judgments, and obligations from several functions and turns them into usable forms. That is one reason weak transparency often signals deeper organizational weakness. If teams cannot explain the system clearly to one another, they will struggle even more when they need to explain it to users, auditors, regulators, or the public. Many organizations fall short not because they reject transparency openly, but because they handle it in shallow ways. They may produce dense technical records that ordinary operators cannot use. They may write user instructions that sound confident, but say little about limitations or escalation. They may create monitoring plans that look organized on paper, but are so vague that nobody knows what action to take when signals turn negative. Another common failure is treating transparency as a one-time release artifact instead of an ongoing duty. Once a system evolves through updates, retraining, policy changes, or expanded deployment, old documentation and old instructions can become misleading even if they were once accurate. For a beginner, one of the best habits to build is skepticism towards surface completeness. A full binder of material does not automatically mean transparency is strong. The better question is whether the people who need to govern, use, or oversee the system actually have the information they need in a form they can understand and apply when real decisions must be made. A simple example can make this easier to picture. Imagine an organization deploying an AI assistant to help support staff respond to customer requests. Good technical documentation would explain the assistant's intended role, training assumptions, evaluation limits, data sources, update history, and known areas of weakness. Good instructions would tell staff when the output can be used as a starting point, when extra review is needed, what kinds of requests should never rely on the assistant alone, and how to escalate a suspicious or harmful response. A strong monitoring plan would define how the organization will sample outputs, review complaints, watch for repeated mistakes, detect drift in request patterns, and decide whether the assistant should be corrected, restricted, or temporarily paused. Now imagine the opposite situation, where documentation is incomplete, staff are told only that the system saves time, and monitoring focuses solely on response speed. In that weaker version, the organization may look efficient for a while, but it is far less transparent and far less prepared to detect or explain harm when the system begins failing in ways that matter. External communication can also be part of transparency duties, especially when the system affects customers, citizens, applicants, patients, students, or other people outside the organization. Not every deployment requires the same level of public-facing explanation, but organizations often need to communicate that AI is being used, what general role it plays, what human oversight exists, and what recourse or support is available if concerns arise. The technical documentation may stay internal, yet it still supports these external duties by giving the organization a truthful foundation for public statements. Monitoring plans matter here as well, because external transparency is weaker if the organization cannot explain how it is checking that the system remains appropriate after deployment. Beginners should understand that public-facing transparency is not mainly a public relations exercise. It is part of legitimacy. People are more likely to trust a system when the organization can explain its role honestly, describe how it is being watched, and respond clearly if someone asks how a decision, recommendation, or automated interaction should be interpreted. As we close, the central lesson is that transparency duties are met through practical governance tools, not through slogans about openness. Technical documentation gives the organization a disciplined record of what the system is, how it works at a relevant level, what evidence supports its use, and where its limits remain. Instructions convert that understanding into usable guidance for the people who rely on, review, maintain, or supervise the system in daily operations. Monitoring plans extend transparency into the future by showing how the organization will keep watch after release and what it will do if the system begins to drift, degrade, or create new risks in live conditions. For a brand new learner, these three elements are best understood as connected forms of accountability. They help different audiences understand the system well enough to govern it, use it responsibly, and challenge it when necessary. In a mature AI program, transparency is not an extra layer placed on top of deployment. It is part of what makes the deployment responsible, explainable, and defensible in the first place.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.